The sun has gone down at Hangman's Hill, and the ghost at Misery Corner isn't walking tonight. So, welcome to the Weird Tales Radio Show, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic, and folklore. And now, here's your host, writer, award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and sometime werewolf hunter, Charles Christian.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Weird Tales Radio Show, the home of geek, folklore and paranormal entertainment, with me, Charles Christian, as once again we delve into the worlds of weirdness, urban myths, history, geek culture, ghosts, magic, witchcraft, the occult, and anything else I think will intrigue you. I'm relieved to say that after last week's alarms and excursions dealing with banks, multiple departments, insurers, accountants and police fraud squads after my business account was hacked, the past 7 days have been a veritable walk in the park, with the only cloud on the horizon being a dust cloud of my own making as I set to clearing out 2 old stables here at El Rancho Weirdo. Along with piles of mouldy hay and rotten pallets, I also encountered a large number of long dead and now well mummified rats. Clearly the rat poison I put down did work. I have become the Grim Squeaker, the death of rats, which is a reference only fans of Terry Pratchett's Discworld novels will get. Let's get on with this week's show, which contains another interview I thoroughly enjoyed taping, this time with American journalist, author and blogger Marc Hartzman. Marc has been described as one of America's leading connoisseurs of the bizarre, and as bizarre as Robert Ripley. Hartzman considers both high compliments, since his passion for the unusual started with Ripley's Believe It or Not during his youth. In addition to his books about Mars, Oliver Cromwell's Embalmed Head, no really, Weird Things on eBay, Sideshow Performers and Unorthodox Messages from God, Hartzman has written for Mental Floss, The Huffington Post, AOL Weird News and Bizarre Magazine. He's discussed oddities on CNN, MSNBC, Ripley's Radio and the Travel Channel's Mysteries at the Museum. Here's the interview. Great pleasure to be talking to Marc Hartzman now. And Marc writes the kind of stuff that I just love. The bizarre, the weird, those things that leave you scratching your head thinking, did people really believe that? Did they really do that? What got you into it in the first place?
I've always loved just really weird history. I think going back to when I was a kid, I used to watch Ripley's Believe It or Not on TV. I would get the Guinness Book of World Records back when they were just those small little black and white, really thick books. And I would really love the first like 20 to 30 pages where it was the human oddities. And there'd be images of Robert Wadlow, the world's tallest man, who was 11 feet, 8.5 inches tall. And that would just amaze me. Like how could someone get that tall? These pictures were just extraordinary. And so I'd look forward to that every year. They'd have different pictures every year. You know, this was pre-internet. And there'd be the little people and, the guy with the long, crazy fingernails, like all that stuff. I loved it. And then, I watched The Elephant Man when I was probably too young, the David Lynch film.
Yes.
And The Elephant Man that just got ingrained in my brain. So I've always really liked this stuff since I was a kid. And then in college, I started publishing a magazine and then I met, and that was just kind of more about like music and pop culture stuff I was into. And then I met a guy in New York City who ran a sideshow museum, a freak museum called the Freakatorium. His name was Johnny Fox, and he was a sword swallower who'd been collecting stuff for years, just from his decades of performing and traveling. And he had this just incredible collection of sideshow memorabilia. And so that kind of really got me going more on that stuff, because I always liked that, but then all of a sudden this was sort of a spark. And I interviewed him. I wrote about him for my magazine and for Bizarre magazine. It was published in the UK years ago. Started writing more about weird stuff for Bizarre as well. And that just kind of got me going. I ended up writing a book called American Sideshow. And then I started a website called weirdhistorian.com. Wrote a book about Oliver Cromwell's Embalmed Head. We can get into that. I just wrote a book called the big book of Mars with all this weird, crazy history about Mars. There's, gets into some of the science, but a lot of the early scientific thought, which is really bizarre when people truly believed in intelligent life on Mars and theorized about what they might be like and why. It's just an amazing time to think that at one point, the smartest people on the planet really believed that there was intelligent life on Mars and wondered how we could communicate with it. So those things, it just fascinates me. I love, like you said in the intro, like just amazing that people used to think in certain ways and what it must have been like, especially like the idea of spiritualism. I have a new book coming out called Chasing Ghosts, which will be out in September, which is all about, the spirits, the supernatural, but the idea of spiritualism, Victorian era, where people really, really believed that you could communicate with the dead. I mean, certainly people still believe that today, but there was quite a movement back then where this was commonly believed to be possible. Yeah,
it was a huge thing. And I mean, when you look back at it now and you see photos of the spirit mediums generating ectoplasm, and it looks just so fake, as a lot of it, well, most of it was, that you think, how did people believe it and how did they get away with it? And it's quite fascinating to think, again, maybe not the greatest scientific minds, but a lot of people who you'd class as being smarter than average, they believed it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of that too was, you had a lot of these male scientists who were being completely deceived by women.
Yes.
And they probably didn't think that was possible, just given, the sexism at that time, that how could I be fooled by this woman? But sure enough, they were. But these women also, I mean, they were incredible with what they would do. These female mediums, Eusapia Palladino, Marjorie, Mina Crandon, the Boston spiritualist who, was butting heads with Houdini basically in the 1920s. Mm-hmm. But these women were basically just pulling off all these incredible illusions, like lifting tables and creating, floating things around rooms and, all these things that made people truly believe, throwing voices, changing voices, all these amazing things. And it took magicians, usually were the ones who could figure out what was going on. The scientists were pretty much, like you said, were buying into it. But it's incredible that they could figure out how to do all these things and fool so many people.
Well, it actually makes you a bit queasy when you hear from where they used to stash their fake ectoplasm.
Yes.
What? Oh gosh.
And they would do checks in there as well. They would check the orifices to make sure they weren't hiding something. And so maybe, either they were really hiding them very well, or someone was in cahoots with them to say that they checked them, but, hadn't thoroughly checked them or, claimed they were clean.
Yeah.
Lots of stuff going on.
Yeah. I mean, do you think, I know we're slightly jumping out of a line here. We're onto your Chasing Ghosts book, which I think you said coming out in September.
Yeah, September 28th.
Oh, right. Yeah. And I was just wondering if the date was fixed, because I know a lot of publishing schedules have got knocked out by coronavirus and things like that, things slipped.
So far, so good.
Yeah. Good. Do you think that there was an element of people wanted to believe that you could communicate with the dead, and therefore they were more prepared to believe it, or if you like, they weren't going into it with an impartial look. They were hoping, and any sign would be a good sign. I mean, you get people like Arthur Conan Doyle and things who, really wanted to believe.
Yes, his story is amazing. I think that's a huge part of it, because grief, grief makes you want to still have a connection with a lost loved one. And at least within America, modern spiritualism here kicked off in the late 1840s with the Fox sisters in Hydesville, New York, 1848. And shortly, it built up from there across the pond, became huge in England. But then here after the Civil War in the 1860s, you just had this massive amount of people who had died. Yeah. And you definitely had a lot of people families who were grieving and were very willing to believe that they could still be in touch with their lost loved ones. So I think that was a huge part of it. And then there's another surge of it after World War I.
Yes.
Which is when Arthur Conan Doyle would have been very much into it.
Yes, exactly. That was sort of the last big boom, I think, in spiritualism. Obviously, still goes on and still has a huge following. But yes, it was that, and I suppose the fact it was people who had died prematurely. It was people's sons who were being killed in battle.
Right.
So you've got that extra grief element on it. Yes. No, it's quite fascinating. And I mean, the thing is that it survived the Fox sisters, because they later sound like a band. They later broke up over, I don't know, spiritual differences, and one of them confessed that it was all, that it was all a hoax. But it didn't sort of kill it dead. It didn't sort of die away and, oh, well, we're not going to have anything. It didn't seem to undim what they were doing.
Yeah, people didn't want to believe that. They thought that she was just doing it because maybe she could cash in on being against spiritualism.
Yeah.
And obviously that wasn't the case. But they found plenty of reasons not to believe. And by that point, I think it had spread so thoroughly that, they're not going to believe that she would just come out and say that now.
Yeah.
she must have some ulterior motive to say that.
Yeah. So let's go and talk about one of my favourite topics, obviously, because I'm a Brit, but that's the embalmed head of Oliver Cromwell, which is a wonderful saga. Wonderful is probably not the right word, but for sort of the background is Oliver Cromwell was the ruler of England in the mid-17th century, and he was responsible for King Charles I being tried and executed. And after Oliver Cromwell died and King Charles II, his Charles I's son, came, the regicides, all the people who'd signed King Charles's the first death certificate, many of them were executed by the rather gruesome method of being hanged, drawn and quartered. And just to show what they thought, they dug up 3 of the leading members of the Cromwell government, including Cromwell, and executed their bodies even though they were dead. And so they were hanged and beheaded, and their heads were put on spikes outside the Palace of Westminster, because that's what people did in those days. But then Cromwell's head then takes on a life of its own, doesn't it? It's a slightly unfortunate choice of phrase, but it doesn't really end there with him.
No, not at all. This was just the beginning. So, like you said, his embalmed head was put on the spike atop Westminster Hall, and it stayed there for about 25 years or so. And then a heavy storm came through and just broke the wooden stake. There was an iron tip that had gone through the skull, but I guess a wooden stake that was holding it up. Mm-hmm. And I guess it was kind of rotting throughout the years just from the weather and the elements. And the storm finally broke it off, and it falls to the ground. And one of the sentries out there finds it and picks it up, and he takes it home.
As you do.
he's got the embalmed head of Oliver Cromwell like hidden in his jacket. And at that time, I think it was like, okay, this is going to be a problem if I tell anyone I have this thing. I shouldn't have it.
Yeah. So
he kept it hidden away basically until he was on his deathbed, and then told his family that he had this head. And then basically the family then passes it. They didn't want it, so they passed it on to a collector who had like a very early version of a museum cabinet of curiosities. Mm-hmm. And basically the head, we can get into more, but the head basically travels for a total of 300 years until it was reburied in 1960. So Cromwell's head travels throughout England from 1661 to 1960, when it was finally reburied at Sidney Sussex College at Cambridge, just in the antechapel. Mm. And there's a plaque that says it's there, but no one knows exactly where it is, just to prevent anyone from trying to go dig it up.
Yes. And are people confident that the head there is actually Cromwell's head, as opposed to another head that has somehow got in on the act? Because, I mean, there was, I believe, a number of fake heads. Once it was known that there was a Cromwell's head for sale, people were sort of jumping on the bandwagon with other mummified heads that they'd obtained by means foul or fair, and were trying to sell them as well.
Yeah, they were definitely imposter heads. I do think that they're confident that this is Cromwell's head. And in the book, so the book is a memoir, so it's called The Embalmed Head of Oliver Cromwell, a memoir, and it's all told from the head's perspective. So you get 300 years of history from this head's perspective. So it goes through all the real chain of events that are known. Mm-hmm. And then there's some imagined anecdotes that kind of weave in real historical moments. But, I had to fill in a few gaps and create a few things and, give him a perspective on different historical moments. But part of that is talking about those imposter heads. And Cromwell, from his perspective, it's frustrating to know that there's these other heads trying to impersonate him. And this is, and questioning his legitimacy. He doesn't want to be questioned whether he's real or not. Of course he's real. So he goes through the different kinds of tests, and various people throughout the real story did examine the head and give their opinions on it. And one of the cases was in the 1930s. A couple of scientists really studied it, and they had a little bit more technology available to them by that point. And they concluded that it was the legitimate head. They believed it was completely authentic. So, and at the end, basically the last 150 years or so, it changed hands within one family just through 5 different generations. So, I'm pretty confident that family was certain that they had the real head, and that last generation finally just decided it was enough. He was like, this has gone too far. Yeah. So he reburied the head at Sydney, Sussex. Where just so your listeners know, that's where Cromwell had attended college. He didn't graduate, but he had attended Sydney, Sussex.
Yes.
Yeah. And I went to Sydney, Sussex. I met with their archivist and went through a bunch of the files, which was incredible to go through these original documents that they have there in their archives. And he even showed me the handwritten signature of Oliver Cromwell when he first attended, in the attendance book or something of that nature.
Yeah.
So it was interesting to see the places where he was, kind of walk around the area that he was walking around as a student and just be in that place.
And I think one of the keys, isn't it, was that the head was embalmed? Was that the thing?
Yeah, so Cromwell was embalmed and buried in Westminster Abbey. Mm-hmm. So when he was exhumed, as you mentioned, the head was embalmed. Yeah. So it retained some hair and some features. I mean, there's a picture of it in the book, which is it's pretty crazy.
Yeah. Do we know what happened to the body? I mean, one suggestion is his daughter's family smuggled the body away after the authorities had finished re-executing him at Tyburn and chopping his head off, and that it's buried up at what's now called Newborough Priory, a stately home up in North Yorkshire. But they've always steadfastly refused anybody to look inside the tomb. So they're sort of, was it true, or was it merely just a family legend? Do we know what happened to the body?
I don't know if it's known for sure. In my research, I came across, I heard that story. I also heard the body had just been discarded at Tyburn. Yeah. And that may have been as simple as that. There's definitely a few different theories out there of what happened. So I'm not sure if anyone is proven correct or not.
Yeah. There was another theory I read that Cromwell anticipated something might happen to him, so he wasn't buried in Westminster Abbey at all. He was wrapped up in lead and dropped in the River Thames, so nobody could get at his body.
Yes, I've heard that as well. Yeah. I don't know if that's true. I think I do have him commenting on that story though in the book, but in the book I have him definitely in Westminster Abbey.
Yeah.
And there is the plaque there at Westminster Abbey, a very small little plaque on the ground that says that this is where he was. Mm-hmm. I mean, for what that's worth. Yeah. But it's there.
The travels of a embalmed, mummified, well, we call it a head, but it's really a skull, found on eBay. The stuff that you've found on eBay, what sort of things, what are some of the standouts?
Yeah, that was my first book called Found on eBay, and all sorts of weird stuff. One of my favorites was the deer poop paperweight, which was called a pooperweight, which I was very amused by. And I kind of just love the whole visual of this, the whole concept of this thing, kind of imagining what it took to make it.
Yeah.
So this woman is out there collecting animal droppings, and I believe I have either moose or porcupine, and then she's putting it into a crystal paperweight, and she's decorating it with like snowflakes and like evergreen leaves and stuff, so it looks attractive, I guess. So she's, it's a crafting. She's like creating this thing and then selling them on eBay. So what I did was I would find these weird things and I would write the sellers kind of equally bizarre questions. In that case, I told her that I was a animal droppings collector, and I was targeting different regions of the United States and was wondering if she could tell me where the poop came from. And she came right back. She's like, I've got moose poop from, Massachusetts, and, deer poop from Maine. And it was just hilarious, So it was really fun to always hear, no matter how crazy my question was for them, they always had a good response because, they're trying to make a sale. Mm-hmm. There was another really weird one that was a goat toenail bracelet. It was made from like, gosh, I don't know, maybe like 50, 60 goat toenails, which are pretty large and kind of gross. It's one of those things I didn't know they existed. I didn't know people made bracelets out of goat toenails.
No, it's
but
hard
you find these things out.
Yes, it's hard to think anybody would actually want them. It's one of those things. What made somebody sit down and think, what the world really needs? It's more goat toenail bracelets.
Right. Let's go collect some more goat toenails so we can finish this one. I mean, that took a lot of effort as well,
Yeah.
It's a lot of work.
Yeah. What sort of prices were they? I appreciate times may have changed and inflation and everything, but what sort of prices were things like this going for? Because you think, how much money would I spend on a lump of animal poo in a glass ball?
The pooper weights were selling for, I think, $6, so that was not a bad price.
Yeah.
Most things weren't too expensive. Most things were fairly reasonable, so that was good. There was one thing that was a little outrageous that I wish I could have purchased was a full-bodied two-headed calf that was taxidermy.
Yes.
It's beautiful, and the guy had had it, I think, since the 50s, and he was asking $20,000 for it. And he got no bids.
Yeah.
but it was a beautiful example of a taxidermied two-headed calf.
Well,
I would love to have it.
Yeah. Was it in a glass case or just as is?
Just as is. I think it was mounted on a little platform.
Yeah. You just sort of think you're going to have to dust that or hoover that at some point.
Yeah, it would need some care, and it should be in a nice case.
Yeah.
It's the kind of thing that should be on display somewhere.
Yeah. Oh, wonderful. And moving on through some of the bizarre topics you've written about, God made me do it. Things God has told people to do.
He's had a lot of weird suggestions.
Yes.
So that book, that's a fun one. It's basically just uses real quotes I found from people. And this kind of goes back through various newspaper articles, a little over 100 years worth. And it's just the real quotes of people saying what God told them to do. And they're just crazy things. Some of them are kind of funny and quirky. Some of them are just horrific and disturbing.
Yes.
And then I give a little context of what the story was about, just kind of summarizing the particular case. But there's all kinds of things. I mean, there's one of the weird, quirky ones was a guy who he said God told him to build a statue of Jesus out of toothpicks. And this guy was not an artist. And he had like a bum hand from a jackhammer incident. I think he was a construction guy. So he's got like one sort of lame hand and no art skills. And he got 30,000 toothpicks and spent the next 10 years or so building this life-size Jesus out of toothpicks because God told him to. So you have like weird stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And then you've got people who, they chop off a hand because God told them to.
Yeah.
Which is just crazy.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
And then there's the sports, a little bit of sports. God told me to do this in the game or whatever. That's kind of what sort of sparked the idea for me actually was this idea of athletes who always say that, they always thank God or they think that God is on their side or something, which I just find it to be a odd situation, especially for God who, if he's a fan, I mean, here at least, in America, pretty much a different team wins a Super Bowl every year, but they're always thanking God, which makes me think that God is not a good fan.
Yes.
Because he's changing his team all the time. Like,
yes.
What's going on? Well,
yes, rather fickle.
Yes, exactly. He likes me this season, but next season, not so much.
Yeah.
Like, what's that all about? So that kind of just got me going and looking into all these kind of wacky stories.
Yes, because over in the UK, one of the things that always bridles is in one of the World Cup football things, Maradona handballed a goal that resulted in England losing, and Maradona's excuse was God told him to do it. It was the hand of God that did it. And,
yeah. So, yeah, God's for some and not for others. It's just at any given moment, he's changing sides. Like you say, he's very fickle. So, yeah, it's just a strange thing. So, yeah, there's lots of weird stories. There's a guy who was a juggler who there was a case here earlier, I guess a couple decades ago already, a woman named Terry Schiavo who was in hospice care for a long time. It was a big national story here. So he said he was told by God to go juggle outside of her room. So he drove like 300 miles with his family and juggled for days in the parking lot. And it didn't help. didn't change a thing, but he was convinced that this was God's mission for him. So we went and juggled.
Yeah, it's a bit like those cases where people are seriously ill and someone decides that they really will be helped if they hear particular music played. It always seems to be bizarre music they're having chosen, which presumably causes people to say, all right, I'll get up. I'll recover. Anything. Turn that sound off. Yes.
Yeah, well, that might actually be effective then, if it works.
Yeah.
Yeah, this wasn't helping.
You're listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian.
Now, your book on Mars, the Big Book of Mars, which is your most recent published book, I believe, as opposed to the one that's coming out. What got you interested in that as a topic?
This is a good, weird story.
Okay.
So, yeah, because I never thought I would write a book on Mars. I never imagined myself writing a book on the topic of science. But then I mentioned earlier, I started a site called Weird Historian just about end of 2016. I started. And so I had a bunch of stuff I'd already written I could use to kind of get it going. Mm-hmm. But then I had to start finding new things to write about, some new weird topics. So I'd heard somewhere along the line that Nikola Tesla had tried to contact Mars at some point in the early 1900s. So I thought, okay, that would be kind of fun. I forgot where I heard about this, but somewhere along the line I read it. And so I started digging into some newspaper archives to just find some articles about it. And I figured I'd write something up. So when I did that, I put in a couple of keywords. And instead of finding Tesla, I came across another story actually from London, a guy named Dr. Hugh Mansfield Robinson in 1926 claimed to be in telepathic communication with a Martian woman named Umaruru. And this headline was just crazy. I'm like, what is this? So I got really interested in that and I started digging into it more and found a ton of articles on it. This was written up all over the world, newspapers all across the globe.
Yeah,
were commenting on this story. And, he had a lot to say about Martian life. Umaruru was tall. She was about 7 feet tall. She had big ears, kind of tall, pointy hair. The men were a little bit taller, more like 8 feet tall. They drove cars. They had airships. They smoked pipes, drank tea, and they had electrified fruit growing on their trees to give them all their nutrients. So this was Martian life. It was much more advanced than we are here. And he had a lot to say. So then he worked with Rugby Radio Tower, that was connected with the London Post Office, the tallest and most powerful radio tower in the world at the time.
Right.
And he was going to send a telegram to Mars. And Mars at that time in 1926, it was in opposition to Earth, meaning its closest point to Earth in its orbit. Right. So about 35 million miles away. And so they set this whole thing up and they sent the telegram. And it's great because the post office, the people with Rugby, they were like, well, we're going to charge you our long distance rate. And so they did that. And it was great because for them, it was like a really smart way to advertise their long distance rate because it was this notion of that's what they charge was written up in all the articles about it. So everyone knew what they charge for long distance. Like, oh, what a deal. So it was pretty good for them. But I actually got all these amazing documents on this case from the British Telecommunications Archive, like just a treasure trove of information. And so it has all these memos about this case and the documents, the letters from Dr. Hugh Mansfield Robinson. And in one of the documents, one of the memos within, internal memos, they talk about whether or not they're like whether or not they should really take this guy's money, because is he just a lunatic? But they determined that he was not. They're like, he seems perfectly sane, and he seems to have committed his life to reaching extraterrestrial life in some way. So they felt like he was of sound mind, so it was okay. Anyway, they don't get a message back. This is probably not a surprise to anyone listening. No message is returned from Mars that night. And he, touches base with Umaruru telepathically. And she explains that basically the scientists of Earth are just not smart enough to understand how to receive their messages. And the scientists on Mars are laughing at us. So he was kind of angry about that. He tried it again in 1928, and again, he had no luck. Umaruru eventually told him to open up a school of telepathy, so that way everyone else could learn to communicate telepathically, which would be much more convenient for all of us. He actually did attempt to open that. I don't think anything ever really went too far with it. But anyway, so as I'm researching all this and covering all this amazing stuff, I started learning about everything else that was going on around the same time. So of course I found the Tesla story I was looking for originally. I found out Marconi had also believed he heard from Martians in 1920. Lots of amazing, brilliant scientists in the early 1900s, late 1800s were convinced there was intelligent life on Mars. And they were trying to figure out ways to communicate with them, whether it was like devising these massive system of mirrors that could reflect sunlight and they could flash light signals at the Martians, or creating a hot air balloon that could ascend 50,000 feet into the air so we could receive their messages without any interference from anything, closer to the ground. That was a couple ideas in 1909, again, when Mars was in opposition, and they were convinced we'd finally hear from the Martians. And again, these guys thought that we were idiots for not having received them. They thought the Martians must think we're all stupid, because the idea was they were much further advanced than we were. And the reason they thought they were more advanced than we were is because Mars it's a smaller planet. So therefore, when the planets were created and they were, they cooled and solidified, that Mars would have cooled faster because it's smaller. Therefore, life would have started earlier, and therefore life would be much more advanced, at any given point than Earth was, just because they got a head start.
And that makes sense. When did H.G. Wells write War of the Worlds? Was that?
Yeah, so 1897, 98 started off, serialized, and then was put into a book.
Right. So presumably he was writing at the sort of height of the Martian, one of the peaks in the Martian craze, was he?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the craze really, I'll just back up a little bit. The craze really got going in 1877. I mean, it had been going for centuries. Just there was definitely a lot of thought about extraterrestrial life out in the universe, and was building in the 1800s. But by 1877, you had an Italian astronomer, Giovanni Schiaparelli, who noticed a network of lines on Mars, and he called these lines canali, which translates to channels, which could just be naturally formed.
Yeah.
But it was mistranslated to canals. And canals are not naturally formed. That means they're artificially made. Therefore, someone is making them. And at the time, the Suez Canal had just been completed fairly recently, and that was like a 10-year project, massive engineering undertaking and achievement. And so all of a sudden, this idea of a whole planet covered in canals, like, wow, these guys must be really good. They must be huge and strong and very smart to have done this so efficiently. And so as that idea spread, and that was really largely propagated by a guy named Percival Lowell, who opened an observatory in Flagstaff, Arizona, and mapped out Mars and the canals and wrote lots of books and lectured all over America and really kind of spread the word. And that, I think, sparked a lot of imagination. And a lot of writers used Mars as like an interesting sort of a way to project different ideas. And a lot of the early science fiction writing, which wasn't termed science fiction at the time, but a lot of the early stories were more about like how to project more ideal ways of life on Earth. So they believed that Martians were advanced and more intelligent. A lot of them were about religion, like, oh, the Martians are so pious and devout, and look how much better life is. If we're more devout here on Earth, we could be like the Martians. So they were trying to use Mars to kind of make life better here on Earth in their own way. And then H.G. Wells comes along and he suddenly turns the Martians into these evil creatures. It's one of the early stories where all of a sudden the Martians are attacking us, which was a great story. I mean, it's a wonderful story.
Yeah.
But it was definitely a turn.
Yeah. And sort of the highlights presumably was Orson Welles' notorious War of the Worlds radio broadcast in 1938.
Yeah, and I love this story. This is one of the stories that I think most people are fairly aware of, even if you don't know a lot about Mars history, just because it was such a crazy event. And so, so there's a huge panic in America. Orson Welles, I mean, he was a genius the way he did this whole story. It's absolutely brilliant. He used basically a fairly new medium, still radio, and he had these emergency break-ins that something was going on, something was spotted. A flash of light or something was spotted on Mars, but the scientists here are saying it's okay, don't worry about it. And then he's cutting back to the orchestra, the fake orchestra that he set up, in the studio, which sounds like regular programming. And it's going back and forth. And all of a sudden, these news alerts keep coming in. They're starting to get more and more dire until finally there's a crash in New Jersey. He switched the location from London to New Jersey to localize it. And then, it's the whole story's unfolding. They're coming out and, they're attacking and, they're starting to slaughter everybody. And it's great because, at the beginning, of course, he announces that this is a dramatization of the H.G. Wells novel. But a lot of people missed it because they were listening to a ventriloquist on the radio, Charlie McCarthy and Edgar Bergen. And I love the fact that they were listening to ventriloquism on the radio. It's so absurd to me that ventriloquism was the big thing to entertain you on radio. It's like the worst format.
Yeah. We used to, over in England, there used to be the BBC on Saturday mornings BBC Radio used to do children's programming, sort of rather tame, friendly, Disney type songs. And it was Archie Andrews was his name, and he was the ventriloquist. He was the dummy. And even as a kid, I thought, well, we don't even need to worry about whether or not we can see your lips move because we can't see you full stop. I mean,
exactly. Just call it like a puppet show or something. But
yes.
It's a crazy thing. But I mean, so that just confused a lot of people. And next thing you know, people are running out in the streets. They're completely panicked. And eventually, the word gets out that it's not real. But it's interesting because to me, having heard that years ago, it just seemed crazy. Like, how could people fall for this? That's so silly. Yeah. What a weird thing to have happened. But then all of a sudden, you put it in context of what they've been hearing for decades. All these major world newspapers talking about contacting Martians or receiving communications from them. You have people like Nikola Tesla, who's arguably one of the smartest people who's ever lived on this planet. Convinced that there was extraterrestrial life and he would contact it and have been contacted by Martians. I mentioned Marconi. I mean, these are like real brilliant people.
Yeah.
This isn't just some schmoes on the street. These are, heads of astronomy at Harvard. I mean, these are smart guys. And so when you put in that context that they've been told this for decades, that there was life on Mars and they were intelligent, they were trying to communicate with us and they might visit us. It doesn't seem that weird that maybe they thought it actually was finally happening and it just wasn't going well. The other crazy thing is that it happened again 11 years later.
I see in the notes about that, but I must admit I've never heard that story. Tell us about that one then.
Yeah, you would think that after this major panic that they'd say, okay, this was not such a great idea. We probably shouldn't freak people out again. But then 11 years later in Ecuador, a small town called Quito, there were a couple of radio DJs looking to sort of drum up some publicity for their station. So they decided that they would do War of the Worlds. They were like, hey, that was a good idea. Let's do our own version. And so they localized it. And they did not give any caveats up front. They did not tell anyone that this was dramatization. They just went straight in, dove right into the story. And they had people like impersonating the mayor and impersonating like the local priest. So it sounded really legitimate, these people talking about what's going on. And it got to the point where they had the attack happening just like the next village over or something like that. So not right where they were, but very close by. and saying how the police and everyone over there were fighting, and they were getting slaughtered. And so the local police were all flying out of town to go help. Like they were fleeing Quito to go help their neighbors, And then the same thing's going on. You have people fleeing their homes, screaming, terrified, running in the streets. And then finally, again, word gets out, and they were really angry about it. They were pissed off that this happened. So they formed a mob, and they go down to the radio station, and they start like throwing rocks and like throwing, I guess, fire at this building.
Yeah.
And the fire trucks couldn't get there because the crowds had filled the streets and flooded the streets, so they couldn't even get there. So they set the building on fire, and 15 people ended up dying. It's really crazy. So the Martians, in the end, end up killing 15 humans.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's
a totally crazy story.
It is. It is. And, of course, all that is with just radio. Imagine what you could do on social media now.
Oh, my gosh. All sorts of bad things, I'm sure.
Yes. See here, you're saying one of the experiments with the Viking Lander looking for life had some positive results.
Yeah. Yeah, this was fascinating. So this was something I didn't know about, and I don't know how well known this is outside the scientific community, but I was fascinated to find out that Viking did have positive results for life on Mars. And so I spoke with the two co-experimenters who conducted the experiment back in the 70s. They're both, I think the man, I think his name is Gil Levin. I think he's in his 90s now, and his co-experimenter Pat Stratt is in her, I think, mid 80s.
Yeah.
And to this day, they're convinced that their results stand and were positive. In fact, Dr. Levin still writes papers on it to this day about his evidence and the fact that no one's successfully proven why his evidence wouldn't stand true. At the time, it was believed that it was an exotic chemical reaction versus a biological reaction that gave the positive results. But just in the nutshell, when the Viking Lander touched Martian soil in 1976, it had several different life detection experiments. And the one that got positive results was called the labeled release experiment. Not a very exciting name. But basically what it would do is it would drop a liquid-like nutrient into the soil that was laced with radioactivity. And then the lander would scoop up a sample of the soil. And then it would see if any sort of metabolic response came out of it, if there was any gas that came out of that. And if so, it would be labeled with this radioactivity, so they would know that this gas that came out was from the nutrient that was put in. So basically, if we put something in, will something come out? And they got the positive results. And there were two Viking landers, and the experiment got positive results on both at very different places on Mars. So in his mind, they found life on Mars, or some sort of evidence of life. Something was having a metabolic response. But like I said, most of NASA at the time decided it was an exotic chemical response instead. And there have been different studies over the years that have tried to further that idea, and it's kind of complicated to get into, but I explain it pretty easily in the book. But they kind of go back and forth on what it might be or what it might not be. But like I said, to this day, it's never been completely proven or that he did not get positive results, or that the positive results were for some other reason. It's all theoretical right now. So he's convinced he found life on Mars, and it seems like there's a good possibility that they could find something. And find more substantial evidence that everyone can agree on once I think they can get further below the surface of Mars, where they know that there's water, they know that there's ice deep below the surface. Yeah. And at that point, you get away from the radioactivity, from the sun, because really nothing can live with all that, cancerous rays hitting the surface of Mars. But once you go underground, I mean, if you look at Earth has a majority of the population of living beings on Earth are underground, insects and so forth. Yeah. So why couldn't there be some sort of microscopic creature, some sort of microbe living under there? If there's water, there's the ingredients for life. You're protected. So it seems possible that they could find something someday, which is exciting.
Yeah. No, that is very interesting. Okay, now tell us about your upcoming book, because you've written a book called The Talking Dead, And now you've got Chasing Ghosts. Are they on the same topic, or what's the situation?
Yeah, so the Talking Dead was just kind of a fun thing I put together, more edited together, where it's just excerpts from old books, mostly from the late 1800s, early 1900s, about what people said the dead were saying.
Right.
So here's a medium who said, this is what I was told by the spirits about the afterlife, and here's descriptions of the afterlife and various topics. And then there's various quotes from very famous people, Edgar Allan Poe writing from the dead, Mark Twain writing from the dead, Shakespeare. Shakespeare is very prolific from the dead. He wrote a lot of stuff. He wrote Hamlet in Heaven, which is great, the sequel to Hamlet. So there's excerpts from that. There's a whole piece on Mars as well from a spiritualist. So it just kind of presents all these different voices from the dead, what was actually said, and some kind of interesting thoughts that they were giving. And certainly the famous stuff is kind of fun, just sort of creative. We had George Washington was a big one, and Abraham Lincoln had a lot to say, political views from beyond. So yeah, that was just kind of a fun thing to put together and just interesting material. And then Chasing Ghosts, that's much more, me researching and diving into these different topics. Spiritualism, as we talked about earlier on, is a big part of it, but it also gets into different kinds of haunted places, what might be causing them. There's actually a couple of really interesting cases from England. So there's the Borley Rectory, which is here Price called the most haunted house in the world, or most haunted house in England. So I cover that, which is pretty interesting. And then there's an interesting case from started in the late 70s, a guy named Vic Tandy, who was a scientist who was working late one night in like a warehouse type place, and people had said that it was haunted and they had sort of paranormal experiences there. And so he was on the side, he was a fencer, like he would do fencing.
Right.
And so he had his blade, and he brought it in one night to sort of, I guess, polish up his blade to get ready for a tournament. Yeah. And he noticed it was kind of wiggling when it shouldn't have been. So I thought, this is odd. So he starts looking into it, and he does some experimenting and exploration. And he discovers there's this really low frequency wavelength that's going through, that's like created by some industrial fan that was going on there. So it's called infrasound. So we don't detect it, but it's happening. And apparently this infrasound wavelength can really mess with your head and your eyes. So it can cause all different kinds of experiences, and it can make you see things. Like it affects your eyeballs so that you start to see things. So it started to explain like what might cause different paranormal activity. And then he took it to various places and kind of discovered infrasound in other places that are typically considered to be haunted places, like narrow hallways, for example, or basements, cellars. So it's pretty fascinating to see like he'd found some sort of scientific reason that could explain things. Not to say that explains everything by any means. And he notes that as well. He's saying, I'm not saying I've discovered the answer. I'm just saying here's a thing that might answer some things. There's another case along those lines where there was a house I forget where the house was offhand, but basically people had all sorts of, the very typical kinds of haunted house stories that are out there in culture, right? Like seeing things, hearing voices, hearing, knockings, all the kinds of tropes of haunted houses. And a family member came over to the house at one point and said, I knew someone else who had some weird stuff going on, and they had a problem with their heater. I think it was releasing carbon monoxide gas.
Right, yes.
Not enough to kill you, but enough to affect you.
Yeah.
So they had someone come check it out. And also the lamps, like this was before electricity, so like the gas lamps that would light the house were also using carbon monoxide. So sure enough, that was the problem. As soon as they fixed all that, all the paranormal experiences went away. So there's interesting cases. So the book gets into these different kinds of haunted places, different sorts of scientific explanations that could be possible. But then also, I'm not trying to say one way or the other. I'm just kind of presenting evidence on both sides, which to me is fascinating. Like, okay, this might explain some things, but doesn't explain everything. And there's all these other things going on that are really hard to explain. Like there was a guy, Michael Persinger, who ran a test where he put a thing called a God helmet on people. and they put this helmet on, and he could dial up different sorts of wavelengths that would kind of go into your frontal lobes, temporal lobes, and could give you all different experiences. So he could like dial it up, and all of a sudden you might think you're seeing God or an alien or a ghost. So it's like affecting the brain in really weird ways. And okay, so maybe like electromagnetic waves that are created by the more and more technology all around us are causing some of these things if you're in a weird electromagnetic field, which is possible. But then I have another researcher who created what you call the Sham God Helmet, which showed that nothing was happening, but people thought something was happening, then they might think they are seeing something.
Yes.
So it could be just all mental.
Yes.
But none of this is to say that none of this could still be happening outside of all that, So yeah, it's kind of a fun exploration of different sorts of attempts to use technology either to explain away things or to capture a ghost. Can technology help us communicate in some way? And there have been many attempts at that.
Yes, no, that is fascinating. That, and goes back to what people have when they have the god or the fake god helmet on. Goes back to the point we're talking about with spiritualism, that so many people want to believe, don't they? So, your experiences you interpret in a certain way from your subconscious prejudices.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I mean, the mind is the most mysterious thing of all. I mean, it's remarkable what it can do. I mean, the book gets into poltergeist cases as well, and are those caused by the mind in some way? Is there something going on there?
Yeah,
that might have nothing to do with ghosts, but might just be a person who's having some sort of stressful situation that's manifesting in a really bizarre way, through some kind of psychokinetic energy. So, it's all fascinating topic, and I just kind of love the mystery of the whole thing. It's fun to present the evidence and, for and against and different cases, but kind of let the reader decide, like, where do you want to believe? It's hard to, it's something we'll never know the true answer to.
Well, we will do, but we'll be dead, and
yes,
when we find out the answer.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, and let's just hope that when we're dead, we don't have the same problem as Cromwell's head. Yes. Now, you're involved with something called Curious Publications.
Yes. So this is something I started doing a little while ago, and I'm republishing old public domain books, and then doing some stuff as well. It's like the Talking Dead I put out through Curious Publications, because that's mostly all from public domain materials, and I edit it together and write some commentary and introduce different topics, so there's context for things. But for the most part, I'm republishing old public domain books that I just find really fascinating, kind of odd and obscure books. So a lot of them are around these topics that we're talking about, of course, because that's what I like. Like one of them is How to Speak with the Dead, a handbook, which is great. Gives you all the steps. There's one called Spectropia, which I love, from 1864. And it was put out by a guy who was kind of tired of all the spiritualism stuff. And he's like, look, it can be explained. The eyeball does lots of weird things, and that can explain why you're seeing stuff. And I can prove it. So he's got these illustrations of ghostly figures in the book, and each one has a little point that you're supposed to stare at. And if you stare at it for like 20 seconds, then you look at a ceiling or a blank wall, you'll see that image kind of float by as a ghost.
Yeah.
So it's just kind of a cool, like, interactive book from the 1860s with just beautiful illustrations and a really amazing cover. So I love stuff like that. There's another one I did called The Sight of Hell. It was written by a reverend in the 1800s. This book is absolutely insane. Basically, I guess he's trying to scare kids straight. Like, hey, because it's subtitled as a book for children.
Right.
And it's just terrifying. I mean, he's describing hell. And if you do something bad, you're going to hell. And look how bad hell is. And there's demons who are gonna prick you for millions and millions of years, and they're gonna strike you every minute of every day for millions and millions of years. And isn't that horrible? And look at that boy over there. Do you hear that sound? That's the sound of his head boiling. His brain is boiling, and his skin is boiling, and it goes on and on. And then ultimately you find out that, like, the kid went to a dance or something, and he wasn't supposed to go to a dance. So that's why he's boiling for eternity. And it's just full of gruesome stuff like that, with very vivid language and lots of different, instances of people being tortured in a dungeon, like the Boiling Boy. That one's been pretty popular, actually. But yeah, it's a weird one.
Yeah. And you've got a website to go with that. We do include all the websites on our website and the podcast data and on our YouTube channel. So that's curiouspublications.com, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. That's fascinating. As with all writers, once you've got one book away, you're always working on another one. What's your next project going to be?
Yeah, well, you're right. I definitely am. In fact, I just presented my editor with some new ideas. So I'm hoping to hear today, actually, if they want to move forward for sure or not. But I'm looking into some other weird stuff. I'm looking into UFOs, which would be a fun topic to cover, and lots of material there, especially recently coming out. Lots of new information coming out. And also looking at some fun medical history stuff. I love medical history. It's so wild. I mean, I'm so glad we're living today. And I often wonder, 100 years from now, people will be like, oh my God, 100 years ago, these people were crazy. And thank God we're alive today, you know? But it's fascinating. I mean, just so many misguided practices from different kinds of surgeons or quacks, lots of quackery going on. So we'll cover all that kind of stuff. Be a lot of fun to do.
That's brilliant. Well, Mark, that has been wonderfully entertaining. Thank you ever so much for coming on the show, and wish you well going forward with your new projects, and obviously when the new book, Creating Ghosts, comes out. Thank you ever so much for your time.
Thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun to do. Appreciate it.
And a big thank you again to Marc Hartzman for a thoroughly entertaining and enjoyable interview. We'll have links to all Marc's websites and books on the Urban Fantasist website, in the podcast metadata, and on our Weird Tales Show YouTube site. However, the two main ones to look out for are www.weirdhistorian.com and www.markhartzmanbooks.com. And that's Mark with a C, not a K. And that's it. Now it just remains for me to say, this is Charles Christian saying thank you so much for listening in. Please join me again next week for more weird tales in weird times. Until then, stay well, stay weird. Goodbye.
Black Shuck, the demon dog of East Anglia, is baying at the moon, which means it's time for us to go. You've been listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, folklore, and the paranormal. You can keep in touch with us online at www.urbanfantasist.com, by email to urbanfantasist@icloud.com, and on Twitter @urbanfantasist. Join us again next week for another edition of the Weird Tales radio show. Goodbye.